how many natives can read. And it was like, that was a statistical data set. Who's capable of reading, who's not. When you think about that, it's really racist. It's horrible. But now when we think about data sovereignty, it's like, what questions are we asking? What data is appropriate to collect? Who should be collecting it?
That's Daphne Littlebear, and this is the Powerful Ladies Podcast. Hey guys, I'm your host, Kara Duffy. Statistics and education are a part of our everyday lives in American culture. What we don't often think about is how the presentation of education to kids can change their acceptance to or trust in that education. Similarly, we often are not looking at how our data is being gathered for us to make decisions as a community. Today's guest, Daphne Littlebear, is taking on all of that for Indigenous and Native communities in America. I'm excited for you to hear her journey and to gain a new perspective on what it means to be counted and understood in America. Well, I am really excited to get to have a conversation with you today.
Yeah, me too.
Let's begin. Please tell everybody your name, where you are in the world, and what you're up to.
Yeah, so my name's Daphne Littlebear. I am in Santa Ana Pueblo, New Mexico. I'm also from Santa Ana Pueblo. I'm also Creek, Shawnee, and Yuchi from Oklahoma. So I'm an Indigenous woman.
And you're working on a really amazing dissertation right now. Your dissertation is Affirming the Educational Sovereignty of Santa Ana Pueblo, the Intersections, Community-Based Education, Western Schooling, and Tribal Citizenship.
Yeah, that is correct. So that is my working title for my dissertation. I'm currently in the final stages and hope to defend in coming this summer of 2022. So soon to be Dr. Littlebear.
Which is so exciting. Congratulations. What will your doctorate be in? Because most people hear doctor and they think either psychology or they think medical doctor. What will your doctorate degree be in?
So my doctorate will be a doctorate of philosophy and social justice education.
Which is very powerful and very needed right now. How long have you been working on that? And how did you know that that's the path that you want to take?
Well, I actually didn't really know that was the path. I didn't think I was going to get a doctorate. That wasn't something that I planned for. It wasn't something that I didn't even really know what a doctorate degree was. So I guess I could start there. So I actually started my doctoral program in 2015, fall of 2015. So it's been a while. I actually took some time off in the dissertation writing phase because, I had lost my father, and I think I needed to step back and take some time to mourn and grieve the loss of my father. And so I've been recently getting back into it, but it's been really challenging to work throughout the pandemic because I also work full time with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium as their deputy director of research in student success. So I'm working full time. I'm trying to finish this doctorate as well as, I have a family and I'm very involved in my community here in Santa Ana.
Mm-hmm. So you just have a few things going on. No big deal.
Yeah, I have a few things going on, and I like to support my friends and Indigenous community as much as I can. So yeah, just have a few things happening, but it's all very exciting. It's all very community oriented, and I think we all support each other and each other's goals. But so I didn't know. I'm actually a first gen.
Mm-hmm.
So I had my daughter when I was fairly young. I didn't know. My mom kind of just advised me at the time. She had put to me that I needed to do something with my life. Like, she wanted me to do something with my life. I was a young mother, and she, said, you can either work full time or go back to school and I will help you as best as I can. And so at the time I was like, all right, I'm going to go to college. Um, I went to junior college. It was a tribal college here in New Mexico called Southwestern Indian Polytechnical Institute. And I went there and I, declared liberal arts as a major, didn't really know what liberal arts was. No one in my
Mm-hmm.
family, didn't have their bachelor's degree or didn't really go to college. So I started there and, finished with a small infant child and transferred on to the University of New Mexico. How I got there was one of the advisors at the tribal college. She was so supportive of all students. Like, being a young mother, I was working retail. So I was working retail, going to school, and I think I was just really overwhelmed. And I went to one of my advisors and I was crying because I was like, I don't know I'm going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what I'm doing. This is hard. And anyhow, when I got close to near to graduation, she was like, you got to go on. Like, you're not done yet. Like, you still got to go and get your bachelor's degree. And I was like, what was that? What's a bachelor's degree? And so she helped me fill out the paperwork, and went in as a transfer student and went to the University of New Mexico and declared my major in sociology. And at the time, I was like wanting to go to law school. So, everything was geared towards pre law.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a minor in English to do pre law. And so when I started taking social classes, I had an amazing professor. She was a statistician and she just like worked us so hard that I really enjoyed statistics. I really enjoyed, running, analysis and learning how, data is
Mm-hmm.
collected. And that's where my kind of passion grew for research. And what we call, I'll get into it a little bit, but that was a very Western way of research that I learned. And one of the things I remember is like, there's not a lot of databases that focused in like for Native Americans or Indigenous people or even
Mm-hmm.
people of color. It's all very generalized. And so anyhow, I learned these skills and working with my classmates, they were talking about this program called Ronald E. McNair, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a research program. So they're like, they're like, we're all going to apply. You should apply. So I applied to the program, got accepted, and the Ronald E. program is actually to help you know um, low income students of color, first generation students actually aspire to graduate studies. So
Very
that's kind of
cool.
where yeah, so that's
Mm-hmm.
where that kind of all started. And I started in that program and they were like, you're going to do a full research. You're going to complete an IRB, which is an institutional review board application for an original study. And you're going to work with a professor and a mentor, and we're going to, guide you on what it means to become a researcher and how to apply to graduate school. And so it was a very tedious project, and I was still working retail at the time. My daughter was, growing up, a toddler. I
Mm-hmm.
would take her everywhere with me, and I was still very much involved in my community. And
Mm-hmm.
getting involved in that research program, I wanted to be involved in like student activities. I wanted to contribute to the community. So, I became the president of a student organization, and it was called
Mm-hmm.
NASSER. And from there, we just, we worked on research, presented at
Mm-hmm.
conferences,
That's
presented
very
at
cool.
conferences and traveled. And just fast forward, like years
Mm-hmm.
later, graduated. Like I said, I was a first gen graduate of my family. And post graduation, it was 2008, and that was a
Mm-hmm.
recession. That was
Yeah.
a really rough time.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really have a job lined up. I went back to work retail. Um, And I think, I started working, found a position with my tribe working in the tribal education department. So the tribal education department is similar to a state education department, but it's for the
Hmm.
tribe. And so this is where my career started in
Yeah.
education. And when I was working with the tribe, law school was always a goal. So I did
Hmm.
apply to law school, and you know, I I went through a program like a pre-law summer program, and I thought law school's not really for me. Like,
Hmm.
I enjoy reading the law, I enjoy understanding it, but I don't know if I really want to become a lawyer. I want to
Hmm.
work in like educational policy or become an advocate of educational, like better educational systems for Native students. And so I ended up going to get my MPA
Hmm.
with a focus in ed leadership. So I took a couple classes in the ed leadership program. And during the same time, I started, one of my friends had asked me to run for the school board, the local school board. And, I looked into it. I went to, there's a training program at the time. I can't remember what it's called, but it was for women of color to see if they wanted to run for public office. And it, I just felt overwhelmed. I was like, I'm not ready to do that. That seems like a lot of work. I think it's mostly like the election process that
Yeah.
intimidated me, to
Hmm.
put myself out there because,
You could do the work, but the election part's a whole other beast.
yeah, the election part's a whole nother beast. And I think, I don't know, but I've always had this kind of fear of putting myself out in a public way like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it felt super real. If you had to run for the school board, you would have to put yourself out like that, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I also didn't feel confident in my abilities a little bit. Like I felt, I still needed to grow. But so anyhow, I was telling one of my other friends, like, I don't think I'm gonna run. I don't think I'm ready. And they're like, well, I'm gonna nominate you for a different board. And it was the National Indian Education Association. They're like, we'll nominate you for that. You can run as a student since you're still in grad school. And I was like, okay.
Hmm.
Um, it's like, no, not the local board. I'll do the national board. Um, and it's, NIA, it's a national organization. It's over 50 years old. They do a lot of advocacy for Indigenous education. Um, and their headquarters is in DC, so they do advocacy on the Hill. They do advocacy regionally, locally,
Hmm.
with state agencies, and they also have becoming a technical assistance center for Indigenous educators across the nation.
Very cool. So you diving into the Indigenous educational system in at least the US, where where is it doing great, and where are the gaps that continue to show up where advocates like you are just so important?
So one thing is that for Indigenous, so if you look at any statistics when it comes to education, you're always going
Mhm.
to notice that Native students are very low performing in a
Mhm.
lot of areas. But I don't think that really tells the story of Native students fully.
Mhm.
I have the standpoint that, student based assessments are inherently racist testing systems. And then, too, there's inadequate services and resources that are channeled to what we call like native serving districts, like school districts or school systems.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this is going to bring up another part of it, but um, so there's what we call schooling, right? Public
Mhm.
American public schooling. That's called schooling. And then there's Indigenous education. So Indigenous education um, is any type of learning that takes place within an Indigenous setting. Like within our community, it could be like native languages, it could
Mhm.
be native farming, it could be you know, creating regalia. It could be like any type of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Indigenous people have have all these different unique skill sets that have allowed us to flourish for so many centuries and so many years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that those aspects of Indigenous identity are not necessarily incorporated in American
Mm-hmm.
schooling systems. We
Mm-hmm.
barely even know the history of Indigenous people in public schooling. Like I, growing
Yeah.
up, didn't learn my own history until I was in college, and I had to seek that out for myself.
Mm-hmm.
So we're dealing with a very inherently racist system. And then on the other side, if we go back to history, um, there is a policy called the Indian boarding schools.
Yeah.
And Indian boarding schools are what they did was they kidnapped indigenous students. Like so a long time ago, when they were organizing these boarding schools, it was the U.S. government organizing these boarding schools a lot with pa- um, with churches, like
Mm-hmm.
different, like the Catholic Church, the Christian churches. They received funds, federal funds from the U.S. government to organize these boarding schools, and so these boarding schools weren't necessarily to empower Indigenous people or students. They were more or less to acculturate us and to
Mm-hmm.
assimilate us into American society. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it's a really heavy history for this
Mm-hmm.
country and for us.
Yeah.
But when you think about how education was introduced to Indigenous people, that that overarching kind of idea is still very much present in today's school systems.
Yeah.
And if you can even like search, there's a gosh, I'm trying to remember what the organization is called, but it's the National Boarding School Healing Coalition,
Mm-hmm.
and they are based in the north west region of the country, and they are about truth and healing in terms of like what is the true history, what is the healing that is taking place, and how can allies support in and support in truth and healing for Indigenous communities. Currently, this is really sad, but there are mass graves that are currently being unrevealed in Canada and in this country
Yes.
of children who attended these boarding schools. And so for myself as an advocate, it's telling these true histories, but
Mm-hmm.
also our children have to go to school. It's kind of it's a state law, right? It's a
Yeah.
state law, but our children deserve opportunities. They deserve to flourish. They deserve to, be who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we make education systems healthy for them? How do
Yeah.
we support that? How do we target resources for them to flourish in these systems? Now, things are not perfect, but they are getting better. You see, so here locally, I will say, um, there's a school. It's not in the public schooling, but it's more in a tribally controlled school. It's the Santa Fe Indian Santa Fe Indian School, and
Mm-hmm.
they're just doing phenomenal things up there. With their curriculum, with their services, and it's really governed by the 19 Pueblos here, and even the educators there are flourishing in terms of how do they indigenize their curriculum, and a lot of their students are going to um, very elite universities, Stanford,
Mm-hmm.
Harvard, public institutions. So I think it's just creating these opportunities for our students to really truly learn and be who they are,
Mm-hmm.
and have education as an exchange rather than like a top down, like the teacher, right? So they're
Mm-hmm.
learning together.
Yeah. There is even in the completely Western American schools that I've been to, there was still conversations of how do we approach people where they are. And it's, I've been to 11 different schools growing up. We moved a ton, and seeing just how different schools in different cities and states taught differently, whether it was, how can kids perform in 700 size, grades, or how can kids perform when there's only 80 kids in a grade, and seeing the differences. The education system in the US is something that I know at some point I will get more involved in because I've seen different things. And to me, like I'm a lover of learning.
Mhm.
And I want other people to know that if you love learning, you can literally learn whatever you want and create whatever you want. And it breaks my heart hearing these stories you're sharing of people resisting, um, or not resisting because it wasn't on that, but like being introduced to education in a way that makes you want to resist it because it was forced or it was aggressive or it just was like stripping away your identity in order to have it, which is all heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, there are systems that are getting better, but there's still so much work to be done. And this month, I know this episode's not going to air till later, but we are
Mhm,
currently in November, and it's Native American Heritage Month. And
mhm,
so I think one of the ways to get involved is to just start, following some Native driven organizations. A lot of these organizations have like call to action of how
mhm,
we can support each other, how allies can support,
mhm,
even just sharing their information with, with your network of friends or network of professionals. It supports because I think a lot of it has to do with just recognizing the history that happened and then
mhm,
being like, okay, that history happened. Where are we now and how can I support? And a
mhm,
lot of these organizations talk about, um, if we are doing these action movements, that Indigenous people be at the forefront of the conversations, that we take their lead and what they are asking for, because
mhm,
each region is completely different and
mhm,
what kind of supports that they need. So I guess for me, it was, working with the tribal education department, working with the public schools that really got me interested. And then, my aspiration to be to go to law school was like reading, these case laws
mhm,
about how it's impacted us and looking at
mhm,
educational policy and being, wow, this is like a really huge thing. So, that's why I ended up going to get my master's and ended up working with NIEA. And, towards the end of my master's program, I always, it was so one of the reasons that I didn't go to law school, not one, but this actually stands out in my head is when I was telling one of my mentors, like, oh, I applied for law school. And she looked at me and she told me, she's like, Daphne, you're not a lawyer, you're a researcher. And I was crushed. I was like, why are you telling me this? I already applied, or I'm already in the process of applying.
mhm,
And it's not that, it's just weird because she saw me in a different light that I guess I didn't recognize in myself.
mhm,
But when I was finishing my master's program, I knew I wanted to go at my doctorate. I just didn't know where. And then this opportunity presented itself with Arizona State University. And it was a program that was focused for Pueblo people, Pueblo Indigenous people within New Mexico. And it was in social justice studies.
mhm,
And I was like, okay, I'm a planner. So I've always
mhm,
had like my letter, my personal statement, my CV updated. I always had like a reference list of people I would ask for recommendation letters. Like I always had this tucked away, like it was just ready to use at some day. And I saw the application date. It was like, I think I had a month to apply.
mhm,
And I was like, oh my God, that's really short time. But I was like, okay,
mhm,
I can do this. And I literally rushed around, got everything really last minute and applied. And it was really scary because I was like, I don't know how this is like, I don't know, like we'll see what happens, right?
Yeah.
And I finished up my master's. So that was another thing that was like another highlight because I was not only first gen for a bachelor's, but first gen for getting a master's in my family. And thank you. And at the time, um, I was with my tribe, working for my tribe for 6 years, but I wanted to grow. I
Hmm.
wanted to grow professionally, and I resigned from my tribe, and that was really hard. And I had another position lined up, but it was like a turning point. It was a
Hmm.
turning point because this other position I took was worked for a community college as an advisor. So it was a little bit away from my focus area of working with Native students, but I just felt like I needed to grow professionally. And so it seemed like all these things were kind of tangent up in the air at one point. And I didn't stay very long with the community college. It was like I think I only stayed for about 6 months, and I thought this isn't where I need to be. And I
Hmm.
resigned. And around the time that I resigned, I had nothing. Like I didn't have a job. I didn't know if I was going to go back to grad school. Haven't heard whether I was accepted or not.
Hmm.
And it just felt super scary. It felt so scary because that wasn't like me. I would always have something lined up before I left, a
Hmm.
position, or I would have a part-time job, or I would know what I was doing. I would say about a week later after I resigned from my position, on our feast day. So we have feast days here in the Pueblo, and it was on our feast day, July 25th. And I got a phone call from an Arizona area code, and I answered the phone, and it was Dr. Elizabeth Samita Human who called me and said, "Congratulations, you have been accepted into the program. And we'll give you some time whether you want to accept, but I just wanted to call you personally and let you know that you have been selected to be in the public cohort, and focused in justice studies. And we look forward to hearing back whether you would like to start the program." And I was like, "Oh my God, is this really happening? It's happening." Right. So I was like, "Well, thank you. I appreciate you calling." Yeah, like I don't even know how I ended the conversation. I just know that I was standing in the living room with my family, and I was like looking around. And I told them I got accepted. Like I'm going to start the doctoral program. Like this is
Hmm.
happening right now. And everyone was super excited for me, but none of my family knew what a doctoral program was. Like all they've known is like I've been in school.
Probably forever from their perspective. Yeah.
Yes, forever. It's like, and being first gen, you get these comments where it's like they're happy, but they don't really know what it is. Or
Hmm.
they're like, "Well, what does that mean? Like, are you going to get a job? Like, because for my like my mother, my auntie, and their generation, like success was getting a government job or
Hmm.
working with a really high profile company where you have benefits, right? And you get a
Hmm.
retirement. Like for them, that was like security. Like their sense
Hmm.
of success is like this security of having a constant paycheck. And I
Yep.
think for my generation, I feel like, I mean, I don't know if it's my generation or if things have shifted because the market shifted, right? You don't
Hmm.
you don't see a lot of people in positions for 20, 30 years anymore, right?
Not at
And
all. Hmm.
and then for me it was like, how do I explain to my family that I just don't want to be somewhere like for 20 or 30 years? How do I explain to them? And how can I like have them be proud of me that I'm taking on my life in a different way, and
Hmm.
that this engaging in college or working or being part of a movement for Indigenous people looks different.
Hmm.
and I'll be okay. Like
Yeah.
I'll be okay. Like I'm not gonna, you know, not have I'm not gonna starve. I'm not gonna, like, I have a home. I
Hmm.
have a vehicle. I have income. Like I can support myself in this way. It just may not look like what they want for me. So I think that was a really hard thing for my family to accept.
Hmm.
Um, but I just had to tell them to trust me, and that I have, like, I don't know where I'm going, but I have a sense of what I need to do to get there. And that sounds a little bit weird, but it made sense to me. And I think the reason why it felt good is because I surrounded myself with like-minded people, right?
Hmm.
And I just had amazing friends that were kind of in the same boat. I had mentors. And not only that, but when I started the doctoral program, you're around different conversations that you may not be around, like in other spaces. And so I was like, so for me, I was like, okay, this doctoral program, I'm going to finish, I'm going to, work in academia. But now, like almost at the end of it, it's different. Like, I'm not sure what's going to happen for me in the future, but I'm starting to plan. And there's a few things I've learned along the way, but the doctoral program, for me, I guess starting it was amazing because I had a cohort of 11. There was a cohort of 11. And so I had
Hmm.
10 other Pueblo scholars that I worked with, that we learned together. And they're all in different type of fields, whether it be education, whether it be planning,
Hmm.
whether it be the health field. And I think we all supported each other through the process. And I do miss them because some of them have graduated and some of them we're still working on our dissertation. Um, but for me now, um, I guess during this part when I started the doctoral work, I actually found a position. I like again, I was between things. I was doing contract work. And I think this is where my family was kind of worried. They're like,
Yeah.
you need a job, right? But I found a position and it was with the New Mexico Public Education Department working in the Indian Education Office.
Hmm.
And that job was more of educational policy focused. And when I was working there, I was working full time and doing my doctoral work full time.
Hmm.
So it was like double. And of course,
It's a lot.
yeah, it was a lot. And when I walked into the position, I always knew working for a state agency was political, but I didn't feel like I was prepared for what I was going to enter into.
Hmm.
And this was also when I got my state job, part of my family was really, really, really happy because this was something that they knew. Like they were like, "Oh, you have a government job. That's amazing. Like you can stay there for 30 years and you can retire and you'll be taken care of." And I was just like, didn't want to burst their bubble, but I wasn't going to stay there for 30
Yeah,
years.
you're like, mm.
Yeah, like I just let them have their moment and I was just took their advice. But when I took on the position, it was really focused on educational policy, educational sovereignty, and actually we have this piece of legislation here in New Mexico that's called the Indian Education Act, and it was operationalizing the act into real practices on the ground. And
Cool.
so they had just recently passed Every Student Succeeds Act at the
Hmm.
federal level that required tribal consultation. And so that was part of my job was um, carrying out tribal consultation here in New Mexico, like, training the school districts on what tribal consultation is, supporting the tribes and how to have a meaningful consultation.
Hmm.
And not only that, but another part of my job was making sure because we received appropriations through the state, and it was providing grants and funding to the tribes and to the school district. So I did a lot of managing the tribal grants to the school districts and to the tribes as well.
Hmm.
And then we had an annual report that we had to produce every year. So I worked with our team in producing this annual report every year, which the annual report was to give our stakeholders a sense of where we were at in Indigenous education in New Mexico. And there was other initiatives and other conversations in the building, but it was really interesting working for the state. It was interesting to be in that building and understand how educational policy is formed in New Mexico and who was part of the conversations and who was driving those conversations, and where and how we received funding and how it got delivered, and thinking also probably manifesting too, like that we could do better,
Hmm.
and working with educators across the state and how we could do better for our students. I'm no longer with the state anymore, but for the time being, it was, you know, um, my first position as an administrator. And it was really interesting for me to be at that level, but
Hmm.
to also learn and how I could support. And that was a lot of what I did also was train my colleagues on cultural competency
Yep.
within the actual like administration. And so a lot of the times, I was invited to work with my colleagues in other offices, and how do we better engage Indigenous communities, or how can we get the message out there? Or can you take a look at this, and we need tribal voice in this policy. So that was
Hmm.
really good to be. I felt like a diplomat a lot of
Yeah.
the time. It was
Well,
like very diplomatic work.
and I would imagine, as first generation and being of both the Western American world and the Indigenous American world, you probably feel like you're an ambassador every day. Like you're translating back and forth every day and being like, actually, or I have a question. Like, I feel like that's what you must feel like that every day. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. Like I said, I'm not with the state. I moved again with the state. I wanted to move up in my career.
Hmm.
And I found myself at a crossroads. Like I could stay here, a few more years, or I can see what else is out there. And one of my mentors, she's located in DC, and she's been so amazing to me, but she has sent me a job announcement for the position I'm at now, and she's just like, you should apply, Daphne. I think even if it's applying just for the audition, like you should
Hmm.
see how this looks and feels. And so at the time I had kind of like, I think in every position you get to a point where it's like, okay, I've learned my job. I do my job well. Like, what
Yeah.
else? Like, do I move up? Do I take on a new project, or do I do something else? And so that was at that point with the state. Like, um, I don't
And I
know if I
think, oh, and I think that speaks to you being curious, right? And you learn, like, because there are people who get so happy in what they're doing, but I love the fact that you're like, okay, I'm bored. I've grown out of this. What's next?
yeah, or I want to grow more, or
Hmm.
I feel like I have so much more to offer. I think for me, it's always like
Yeah.
I have so much more to offer,
Yeah.
and sometimes I feel like my skill sets are not being utilized to the full capacity that they could be. And so I'm like, how can I utilize my skill set more?
Well, and I'm sure every day you're seeing the gap that still needs to be corrected and filled. And you're like, guys, we have so much work to do. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And so I applied for this position with AHEC, and AHEC is an advocacy group, an advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. as well. And they do advocate for educational sovereignty in higher education for tribal colleges and universities. And as you recall, I started off at a tribal college here in New Mexico. So it just felt like, wow, like I'm at this
Mm-hmm.
point in my life where I can apply for this position, and I actually get to be in a position to support our tribal college students and Native
Mm-hmm.
students in a different way. Like that was me years ago. That was me
Yeah.
years ago thinking of what is college, right? What does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
And the interview was probably the most amazing interview that I've ever had in my life. The interview wasn't like a one-sided conversation. It was more of a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I think the next day I was offered the position. And I was really
Amazing.
excited. Yeah, I was really excited about it because, it was the first time I actually negotiated a salary that I was worth. Um, and that felt like an accomplishment in itself because I don't think I was ever in a position like, no, 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 I take that back. I don't think I was ever comfortable discussing a salary that I needed,
Mm-hmm.
for myself and my family. And I want to emphasize that because I've worked with Mariposa Strategies. She's here in New Mexico. She's an amazing coach. And I want to kind of say a little bit about that too. And I
Mm-hmm.
also started taking some workshops from Native American Lead, and they're an amazing organization. And I think they changed the way that I view myself as a
Mm-hmm.
woman of color, professional, whether, whatever that looks like. And I just felt like had I not engaged in some of um, those networks,
Mm-hmm.
I probably wouldn't have had the courage to ask for a salary um, for myself that I was worth.
And I want to pause for a second because I want to just acknowledge you for like who you are for yourself, right? Because I hear that you are motivated to keep pushing and what's next and how else can I make an impact so much for the communities and the people that you're serving and the students. But it's also it sounds like you are so good at listening to the voice in your head or your heart that's like, there's more, like go for more because, you know, there are all these amazing programs and these leadership opportunities and you keep being like, I'll do that. And maybe it doesn't feel as confident when you say yes right away, but like you keep doing it. So like, I just want to say, like, good for you, Daphne. Like, good for you for being like, we are doing more. I want more. And it's as a coach, I nothing breaks my heart than people being like, I don't know, not for me. And to see you just like, I'll take this and I want this. And yes, I'll have that. And I'll work. Yes, yes, yes. Like, I just, I've just met you and I just feel this over sensing feeling of just like, I'm impressed of like what a badass you are.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I really have to credit my community, my family,
Mm-hmm.
and even my friends,
Mm-hmm.
my chosen families, because I'm just surrounded by very strong women
Mm-hmm.
around. And, we all have our pitfalls. We all have those days where we're like, I don't know what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
We cry together, but we manifest our dreams together and we give each other feedback. And I think what that's kind of where I'm at,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I'm really brutally honest with myself sometimes where it is overwhelming. It is difficult and there are a lot of barriers, but I will attribute um my my resiliency to my family because I was raised by a lot of single women, and my grandmother was a widower, and
Mm-hmm.
so very early in her marriage. And so to me it was like they they I don't know if they like it was more of a survival,
Mm-hmm.
survival, like we got to do this for our families, we got to do this for our children, we got to do this for our communities. And I will say now, my mom, she worked, in a factory job like my whole life
Yeah.
until later in her life. Like she's doing what she wanted to do all these years now.
Mm-hmm.
My mother is a native language teacher, and she worked in like wellness programs, and she's like, right now I look at her and I'm like, you finally get to do the work that you wanted to do. And I, I think this is part of like first gen, or even like BIPOC first gen, is that have I felt guilty about being selfish? I'm not maybe felt guilty about pursuing my own path in my own way. Yeah, I felt like sometimes that's been
Mm-hmm.
selfish, but I also feel like it's not selfish because this is what our parents and our ancestors wanted for us. But, unfortunately, the era or times that they grew up in provided a different type of like
Mm-hmm.
limited possibilities or opportunities. And so sometimes I feel like our generations, like we clash, but I also feel like we clash because we experience things different, but we also love each other because we're supporting each other. And you know um i get to have I get to have this, how would you say this, like I feel very fortunate to be able to do the things I've done in my life, or be who I wanted to be in my life, because maybe my grandmother didn't.
Yeah.
I don't know how. I think that's really hard to talk about that, those intergenerational things. But I think it's important to
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge them as well.
Yeah. I think especially it's part of the female experience, right? Because each generation keeps having more and more opportunities than the ones before us, and um, it there's we're fighting the fight, or we're doing the work that our grandparents or grandmothers and great grandmothers and even mothers like couldn't have imagined was even a choice that we had. I want to come back to something that you said earlier about the power of statistics and why you ended up in this research space, because, you know, so often decisions are made every day about data. And if the data is incomplete or bad or old or outdated, like we can't get back to the truth of what we're trying to discuss, right? There's so much
Mhm,
conversation about fake news right now. And it is easy to rearrange statistics so that they suit what you want to argue.
mhm.
But it really comes down to a root of just having the data in the first place, which is what you're creating for people or have been throughout your career. How I would love for you to speak to that, of like needing the statistical data for the Native and Indigenous populations in the US. Like, give people a sense of like how much of that is missing, um, for those who have no idea about this topic at all.
So it's not a new concept, but it is a new theory to academia that's becoming increasingly more. People are more well aware of it. It's called in data sovereignty, and there is a group of Indigenous scholars that focus on data sovereignty. And they're they've been publishing a lot of work about um, data sovereignty and tribes controlling their own data and
And
data collection.
that's what data sovereignty means. Like the data is coming from the people the data is about.
Yes, or Indigenous people are at the forefront of how to conduct research or data
Hmm.
collection,
Hmm.
or asking questions that are relevant to Indigenous communities. And not only that, but I will kind of take a brief
Hmm.
moment in history that Native people have been very surveillanced. And so when I talked about the boarding schools, there are congressional records and studies about data collecting. And I remember I was actually at Muskogee Creek Tribal College when I was looking at some archives, and I found, some congressional records, and it was like how many natives can read. And it was like that was a statistical data set, right?
Hmm.
Who's capable of reading, who's not. like when you think about that, it's really racist. Um, it's horrible. But now when we think about data sovereignty, it's like, what questions are we asking? What
Mm-hmm.
data is appropriate to collect? Who should be
Yeah.
collecting it? Who
Mm-hmm.
should store that data? Who should have access to the data? And not only that, but for a long time, researchers, our non native researchers, came into our communities, collected data, but didn't really um, share out the data with us or
Mm-hmm.
misuse the data. And
Mm-hmm.
there's like a really high profile court case about misuse of data concern regarding Arizona State and the Havasupai tribe. So now, when you have more Indigenous researchers in the field, we can be at the forefront of those conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can educate our colleagues. So a lot of my position now, as with AHEC, is we do work with multiple foundations and organizations, and I do talk a lot about data sovereignty or even visibility. So
Mm-hmm.
Native populations are so small that sometimes we're not even visible in the data sets that are even being collected.
Mm-hmm.
There was this huge joke last year during the presidential election, and CNN, you can actually Google it, the CNN just put something else. Like instead of saying Native Americans, they put something else. So if you like Google something else and Native Americans, this whole segment with CNN will pop up. So it like made us visible that like, we're even like our populations may be small,
Mm-hmm.
but they are impactful, like even in presidential or local elections. And having it was even shown last year that Arizona flipped to blue.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it was because they had the highest native turnouts last year in voter registration and in voting, and it was largely Democratic. So I think one of the main things with data sovereignty is visibility, and then data sovereignty. Who controls the data? How is the narrative being put place? So with AHEC, they have a unique database that's called AHEC AIMS, American Indian Measurements of Success. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a unique database set that looks at looks at tribal colleges and universities primarily in reporting out, the university statistics, demographics, first gen. So basically, how the university is performing in itself, and who retention rates, graduation rates, what fields are the highest of population. Is it like in STEM? Is it in English? Is it in history? And so it's a really unique data set that's driven by the tribal colleges. And we're still thinking, there's still areas on how we can improve it. But I think that's the fun work, is having a team of Indigenous researchers or individuals are good allies that support data sovereignty and thinking like, how can we improve this data set? How can we, what are we missing? What is going to support more of tribal colleges or Native students collectively? And just sharing those thoughts with huge foundations or research organizations, and like, we need to do better, or if you can be a better ally to us, these are the ways that you can.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always connecting them with an Indigenous researcher as well.
I remember when I was in school, we had a standardized test done, and it ended up being really controversial. And the one question I remember that caused controversy is, where do apples come from? And it was multiple choice. And two of the answers were, they come from like a tree, or it comes from the store. And this is, just an example of that I have in my life of asking a bad question,
Mm-hmm.
because anyone that was, you know, in a more rural place picked the tree.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone that lived in a more urban place picked the store. But option B with the store was the wrong answer, even though the kids were right.
Yeah.
And it's like, we don't, so often things get so messed up in the world because we ask the wrong questions. Like, just the completely wrong question is being asked.
I completely agree. I have a similar story like that. It was in that pre-law program I was in. I was we had like us as students, we had to brief a case and I can't remember what the case title was called, but it had to do with a lawnmower. And they're like, it was a torts case. And it was like, can you start a lawnmower in a garage? And I honestly couldn't answer that question because one, I don't have grass. I've never, because I live in New Mexico, a lot of our landscape is I mean, people have grass here, but I'm just saying a lot of it is
It's
like we
desert
don't have,
landscape.
yeah, desert landscape. There's no, it's you use a lot of water if you have grass here. So I never really had grass. I didn't own a lawnmower, and I never had a garage because we always had a carport or we didn't have a garage. So I was like, I don't know. I guess, from TV, people start cars in garages. I don't know. So I couldn't answer. And the professor was giving me such a hard time. And I literally had to break down and say, like, this is not part of my everyday experience. And the class kind of just like everyone kind of chuckled. And even the professor chuckled because he was saying, like, one of your predecessors had a hard time with this court case as well, because her community lives in a canyon. Like they literally live on a rock. So they don't have grass either. So I think it's, we've heard those type of scenarios for Indigenous students, like, talking about snow when we think of our Kanaka relatives in Hawaii. Like they don't, the closest snow they have is on Mauna Kea, but they don't have it in their everyday life. So that's going to really be hard for them to
Well,
answer.
and even in the going from New England to California, I grew up in New England where there's snow and there's fireflies in the summertime. California, people will be like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "You don't catch fireflies and like put them in a no? What? Like you've never seen a firefly? You've never had a snow day? Like it's just we don't realize how individualized our lives are, even when it occurs that people are coming from the same culture or speak the same language, let alone when there's so many layers that we have no idea about.
Yeah, I agree.
So now that you are in this program and you've already made the impact that you have and you see your calling, like where are you excited to focus as you go forward? And if you don't know, that's also of course okay, but like what are you most fired up about to continue making an impact towards?
Um, so I will be finishing this upcoming year, and I think that's where a lot of my focus is. It's been challenging. And I would say challenging mostly for my, like, how would you say it? Like there's this idea of imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah.
Like I've struggled immensely with imposter syndrome throughout my whole career, my whole educational career. And I think it was at its worst in the dissertation writing phase. And I think it hit me more when my father had passed. I just got in my own head and I really had to work hard on overcoming imposter syndrome and just know that this is where I need to be. And I'm more than capable of finishing, and I am going to finish. And it's okay to not have your next steps lined up, you know? But to be open to endless possibilities. And I think, with having a PhD, I honestly didn't realize how many possibilities are out there for individuals with PhDs, much less women or women of color or Indigenous women. And I am excited to be open to what's coming up next. But I also believe a lot in planning and manifesting. One of my good friends, Dr. Doreen Bird, I want to give her a shout out. She's always talked about manifesting. And she really got me onto like, how do you manifest, right? Like, what is it that you want? What is it that inspires you? What is it that you need? And she really encouraged me to pick up manifesting as a daily or weekly thing. And so right now it's like, how can I work with my coach in manifesting? Because I feel like I have so many things I want to do, that I could feel all over the place. And I feel like I just need that coach to help me kind of pull that out of me a little bit.
Me too. That's why I have a coach.
So, in finishing, I don't, I want to be very focused at the last tail end of the dissertation. I want to be prepared for what's next. And, working with a coach will help me get out of my own head in a sense, but also create better focus. And then, but I'm also really like excited that I even get to do that, right? Because I know
Yeah.
not everyone, like, I never did believe in, I didn't even know what a coach was or what coaches did. And like I said, it wasn't till like I talked to some of my network where they were like, oh, so and so is a coach. And I actually work with them. And I was like, this is what coaching does. Right. So for me, manifesting, finishing the PhD, um, potentially becoming involved in some type of way with my own tribe again. And one of my blue sky thoughts or one of my manifestations is to create a research policy office for my tribe, to implement like a tribal IRB for my pueblo, to potentially have my own consulting firm for Indigenous education and research.
I'm
To
a yes to all these things. Let's do it.
to to be in the classroom as a professor,
Mhm.
to be, potentially a tribal college president, all of these things, to write a book at some point in time. So there's a lot of things I want to do with my path still, and there's a lot of, I want to travel. I've got a little chance to travel, but I want to travel some more. And visit some of my friends that I've made from Indigenous communities and eat like Indigenous foods, and you
Yeah.
know, I want to sew like some of our traditional clothing more. And this past during the pandemic became a aspiring farmer.
Look at
uh,
you.
um, have a little garden outside of my house, but I want to have a bigger plot of land to grow more different indigenous seeds. So I think there's just so much limitless possibilities I want to do. And but I think with a coach, I know I can figure out how to do all this and align it all together somehow because it all feeds into each other.
Yeah.
So I just think the whole idea of manifesting and gratitude practice really does inspire you to keep going, especially in times where self-doubt kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, um, I will say it's been really pretty heavy because of the pandemic. I've had a lot of people pass during this time, and I've had two uncles and one aunt who passed because of COVID, and just know that they have always encouraged my path. And one of my uncles, told me I was the smartest person he knew. And and he's just this macho guy. He was this macho guy. So for him to be like, I love you, niece, you're the smartest person I know, and I would look to you for advice, it made me feel like I can't give up. Even though it feels heavy right now,
Mm-hmm.
I can't give up. I have to keep going. And in my way, I'm going to take as much people with me on my journey. I'm going to encourage people because the thing is like, I don't want to be the only Indigenous woman in the room. Like, I want more Indigenous
Yeah.
women and people in the room with me. Like, you know?
Yeah. I mean, usually I ask people what they think meaning a powerful lady means, but I think you just answered it for all of us. Like everything you just said to me is like what it means to be powerful, right? To take what you've got and run with it, and to be a stand that other people like you join you, and to also give yourself grace because being powerful is exhausting sometimes.
Mhm.
Like I love that when I asked you what's next, you're like, I just got to get this dissertation done. And I'm like, yes, like getting your PhD is no joke. It's no joke, which is why once you have it, you get to just like take a vacation for crying out loud if you want to, because It's so much, especially somebody like you that has so many layers of what you're committed to and thinking about and all the stuff that you're holding up at any one time. So, well, since I can't ask you that question because you already answered it, then I'm going to ask you, where do you put yourself on the powerful lady scale? We ask every guest and we say 0 would be an average everyday human and 10 would be the most powerful lady you could imagine. Where would you put yourself today and where do you put yourself on average?
Oh gosh, that's a really hard question. Today, having shared my narrative with you and my story,
Mhm.
so thank you for holding space for me. I
My
would
pleasure.
say I feel like a 10 because I have to remind myself of where it all started and how I got here. So I definitely feel this high right now of a 10 and like, wow, Daphne, this is where you're at and
Mm.
you got it. You're almost there. Don't give up. On an average, I would say sometimes it fluctuates between like a 5 and an 8.
Mhm.
um, because, as women, we take on so much different things within our families, within our relationships, within our friendships. And I just feel you know, like when my mom would say there's never enough hours in the day, I feel like that because I'm just like, okay, I'm off work, I have a little bit of time to write, I still got to clean. I love doing Zumba, so Zumba is like my outlet.
Mhm.
um and so I'm just like trying to hold it all together. So I think sometimes, before Zumba it's like a 5, but after Zumba it's like a 8.
Well, and being someone who appreciates statistics, I think I'll have to at some point turn over all the data of what every powerful ladies how they've answered that question because I'm sure it's very fascinating on a statistical level. Um, so for everyone who is super impressed with you and what you're creating and causing in the world, how can they reach out to you, support you, follow you, be a contribution to you?
Yeah, so I'm on social. I'm actually on Instagram at Daphne Littlebear. At Daphne Littlebear. So it's DAPHLILBEAR. And I'm also on Twitter with the same handle at Daphne Littlebear as well. I will say that I'm trying to organize my social media better. I haven't been the best in the past couple of years, but you can follow me there. I've actually will probably end up creating I guess a public profile or business
Mhm.
page in the future. So if you want to follow my journey, I'm there. I'm always posting resources, personal stories, um, how allies can get involved in Indigenous movements or BIPOC movements. So you can reach out to me there on Twitter and Instagram.
Perfect. Well, I'll give you a little more space. Anything that you want to share with the people listening? Yeah. What do you want to leave everyone with today?
Oh, gosh. I guess, get involved. Even if you know nothing about Indigenous people, or just get involved. And it starts with following an Instagram account. It starts with signing up for a newsletter from a Native organization. Just get involved in community, support local Indigenous communities. You can even look up the ancestral land that you're living on of Indigenous people. You can Google like native land, or even land acknowledgements, and it'll help pull up an engine search of, what Indigenous communities around you, and start there. Support the local Indigenous community, whether the entrepreneurs, you know, um, just get involved in community. That's always my message. I think once you're involved in community, it just becomes this very different sources of information. You can support entrepreneurs, small businesses, and to be a better ally overall to each other. And, once you start showing up, Indigenous people notice it, and then they'll start being like, hey, we want to invite you here or invite you there or can we collaborate in some way? But I think just getting involved in local events is good.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for being a yes to me and to the Powerful Ladies podcast and for sharing your story with everyone listening. You are a powerful lady, and I'm so excited that I got to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. All of the links to connect with Daphne are in our show notes at thepowerfulladies.com/podcast. There you can also leave comments and ask questions about this episode. Want more Powerful Ladies? Come follow us on Instagram at Powerful Ladies. There are some free downloads to start feeling more powerful today. And we encourage you to subscribe to this podcast and leave us a 5-star rating and review so we can find more listeners like you and those who would be excited to hear about these stories. If you'd like to connect directly with me, please visit karaduffy.com or follow me on Instagram at kara_Duffy. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Until then, I hope you're taking on being powerful in your life. Go be awesome and up to something you love.